Hey, hey.
Jurij, how are you today, sir? It's a pleasure. You doing all right?
Oh my God, I am doing good. A lot of stuff, a lot of stuff. How
Excellent.
about you?
I am doing well. It is
Excellent,
warmed
excellent.
up. Well, Yuri, I would ask you when I say the word philosophy to you, what do you think about, my friend?
Um, like redefining life,
Mm, mm, mm.
in a sense that what it has been for me personally is um the sort of if I was influenced by all these internet self-help gurus of like, oh, you should achieve this, you should have your goals. And philosophy for me is the process of, well, why should I do it? Why the fuck should I do that? Why the fuck should I do that? All the things which have been brought to me from outside or from inside, and then going through that process of realizing what I want, what I don't want, right? And then philosophy becomes the process of defining what's worth desiring,
Mm.
sort of, right? So that's, I guess, what philosophy is for me.
I like that answer. I like also the idea. I think a lot of people with philosophy, there's this sense that it has something to do with quote unquote self-help, but then there's a bad taste in your mouth when you say that phrase, self-help, because of the culture that you're in. And this idea of like, why that help? So self-help, well, what's the self? What's help, right? What does it mean to help? Because a lot of people think they know what's helpful and they end up in a worse kind of situation, right? And I like that idea where you're saying as well that philosophy is sort of the question of what is worth desiring, maybe also to like how do we obtain those things we desire, how is desire even possible, or things like that. Do you think it's possible for philosophy to change what we desire or to only be in service what we already desire? I think it's like Augustine, and there's these old kind of debates on what comes first, knowledge or will, like what we will or what we know. And so there's this old debate that actually, I think one of the things that has hurt philosophy is a lot of people get into philosophy and don't actually examine some of the critical debates that led to philosophy as we know it today. And what's very interesting, I think there's a strong argument to be made, not just in Augustine, but back in Plato, Socrates, all these different people. You can even get to Iona with some of the pre-Socratics and different people on this question of, do we will what we know or do we know what we will? And which comes first? And actually, when we take that debate seriously, we start seeing things like where Lacan, desire, psychoanalysis, and all these things are a big deal because the very quality of our knowing seems to be constituted to some degree by the quality of our willing and different things like that. So let me throw it at you. I'd be careful because it's an interesting debate. Like, when do you think it's more the will that shapes knowing, or is it knowing that more so shapes the will? Does it depend on individuals? What do we think of that? And there's no
The
right
question
answers.
is,
There's no right answers or anything, or at least there's not right answers that I'll tell you are the right answers, right? So we can all live in plausible deniability forever in different things. But it's actually a very open question. And the reason to preface it, one of the reasons I asked this because it's actually economically extremely consequential. Because if will leads to, like, if we will what we know, then creating demand in economics is going to have a lot to do with the information supply, like what people know, because that's going to affect the quality of demand. But if we actually know what we demand, then actually what should come first in sort of economic thinking or political theory or et cetera, so forth, are the questions of changing or directing sort of the quality of demand. So that's kind of looking ahead to these different questions. So I throw it back to you. Do we think that will comes first, knowledge comes first? What are different ways to think of that question?
yeah, well, so what came to my mind is it even worth answering that question? But I guess you just gave me a reason to try to answer that question. Um, so, but okay, can you clarify to me okay, so knowledge and will,
And
uh,
will.
and so knowledge can influence will and will can influence knowledge, right? And so, in just to try to regurgitate back what you said to me is the knowledge you have about your self will influence your economic behavior versus um your will how your will is defined? Wait, no.
Sure. Well, let me put it. No. It's a great question because they are automatically overlapping. Because what does it mean to will something you don't know, and what does it mean to know something you don't will to know? Right. Like if you happen to know something, must you have not willed? And in this context, what's interesting is will classically desire, will, want, all of these kind of overlapped in different ways, right? So we tended to
Yeah.
like will what we desire. So you could also talk about do we know what we desire or do we desire what we know? Right? Can you desire something you don't know? And can you know something you
Right.
don't desire? Right.
Right.
And,
Right.
is that possible? Because, someone would say, well, if it's possible to know something you don't desire, then knowledge must be primary because it's not contingent upon desire. But if someone turns around and says, well, we actually can only know what we desire, then desire is primary because it's possible to desire without knowing what you desire. Right. And different
Right.
people comes down on different debates. So that would be a slight way to maybe clarify a little bit.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense, but I guess you just take these two variables as, okay, we can define take people's knowledge as a variable and take people's desire as a variable. If we look at it economically, I wouldn't try to, solve the chicken and egg problem.
Oh, sure. Do we think philosophy what would it look like? So if it is the case that will and want, or I mean, will and knowledge, I'll say knowledge and desire to keep it more psychoanalytical.
Okay.
If they always go together, what does it look like to do philosophy that keeps them together? Because the argument could be that one of the reasons why philosophy has gotten into trouble is because it actually doesn't keep them together. It actually ends up on one side of the debate versus the other. Where they either end up on the side where they say, well, actually, we will what we know, so let's focus on truth. And then other people said, well, actually, we can't even know truth, so let's just focus on what we want and what we will. Oh, crap. We actually have basically the split between conservatives and liberals today, don't we? We have the whole modern world split down the middle between the idea of, well, let's just focus on truth and knowledge and information. Let's just have the AI. And other people will be like, no, let's just focus on personal stories, like what people desire and what people want, and try to create a place by which these things can be expressed. And what you see is in that ancient debate, it's actually in some respects suggesting the question between repression and expression, the reality principle versus the pleasure principle, and different things, because knowledge would function as the reality principle, what is real there to know, whereas will is going to be on the side of the pleasure principle. And what's very funny, so the first thing I would say on studying philosophy that's really important, in my opinion, is realizing that a lot of the debates are actually just reappearing over and over again through time according to different languages and according to different knowledges and different things. And one of the things that I think hurts with the study of philosophy is that people read it too sequentially. Like they say, oh, it's Augustine, leading to say, well, it'd be more like Plotinus, Socrates and Plato, or the pre-Socratics, and they kind of follow all these different things, versus kind of following a topic that is coming back around in different languages in different ways. And then actually, as a result, what ends up happening is when people talk about, say, the reality principle versus the pleasure principle, they don't realize that they could actually get maybe resources, a way to think about the debate, looking at Augustine talking about, say, like in Confessions or the City of God or all these different things, when he's talking about the debate between will and knowledge, which is all throughout the classical thinkers. They're actually talking a lot between the debate between the reality principle and the pleasure principle. But because they don't have that psychoanalytical language, they're not able to actually talk about it in those ways. And I think actually when you realize that, a lot of philosophy becomes a lot more exciting, because you realize that there's not, how do I put it? What you realize is there's a knowledge. It's more so a tragedy that keeps coming back around. And by tragedy, what I mean by that, Martha Nussbaum in The Fragility of Goodness talked about a tragedy as a trade-off of competing goods. And what she warned about is that we too often think about realities as problems and solutions, meaning we have certain problems, and then when we get the solutions, we solve them and we're done with it, right? Like a math problem. Really, what the philosopher is often in the business of is trade-offs. Trade-offs of competing goods and bothness. Like you said, it's both, right? Well, if it is both, then it is a question of how it is both. In what way is it both? How do they relate? To what proportion? To what trade-off? To what policy that's going to emphasize, say, the want here and the knowledge over there? Suddenly, everything becomes about proportion, order, and as opposed to, say, solving. Oh, well, it's knowledge. It's knowledge over one. No, it's once over knowledge. And then we have our philosophical debates in academia where we write our PhDs, and whatever side you're on, you're done with it, right? Instead, you start saying, no, it's both. But if it is both, then we are dealing with some sort of art form, some sort of measure like cooking, where you're determining the proportions of these different things. If you have a cake that has salt in it, that doesn't mean you have to have a certain proportion of salt. If you have too much salt in your cake, it's going to taste like crap, right? Well, likewise, if you say a society needs freedom, okay, but how much freedom? In what ways? To what order, right? Suddenly everything becomes a lot more proportional, a lot more kind of figuring out the trade-offs. The reason why that's important is then you'll stop reading philosophy and in a way that's trying to determine a side. Suddenly you start realizing that the great thinkers are actually all cross-pollinating, figuring out different points of the trade-off, right? Let's take Keynes and Hayek, right? It's really important. They're seen as and then I'll give it back to you for thoughts. Keynes and Hayek were actually good friends. A lot of people think they were like mortal enemies and hated one another. But Hayek, when Keynes died, Hayek said that Keynes was one of the greatest men he ever knew, right? Well, that's nuts. I thought they were like opposites, Austrians versus Keynesians. I thought they hated one another. Keynes in a letter, and Hayek agreed with this because both of these are great thinkers, great economists. Hayek said, Keynes said, Hayek, our difference with the road to serfdom, because you don't believe in, true anarchism, right? As an Austrian, you believe there should be a government. And Hayek said, yeah, okay. Well, then our difference is simply the size of the government, right? But you in the road to serfdom said there's a slippery slope. So isn't the case that if you have any size of government, you're eventually going to slip into the road to serfdom that you're warning about, right? And Hayek came back and he's like, screw you, Keynes. And Keynes kind of giggled and they got together and ate. Even though I think actually the knowledge problem that Hayek talks about in economics is one of the most severe and serious economic quandaries that I'm not sure if many people who want to move away from capitalism take seriously, because the coordination of resources following prices is an incredible accomplishment. But it also may bring with it various, it works regardless whatever set of values that you have, right? Now I need, please.
Outline the knowledge problem for me.
The knowledge problem is the idea of, imagine that there is a McDonald's down the street. And I ask you the following question. How many plastic spoons does the McDonald's down the street need to order next week? And you would go, and the point that Hayek is getting at is you could be Albert freaking Einstein. You could be the smartest man on earth, and you will not know how many plastic spoons the McDonald's down the street needs to order unless you work there. If you work at the McDonald's down the street, then you are able to determine an informed estimation of how many spoons are going to be needed at the McDonald's, right? So this is what Hayek points out. Hayek points out that the majority of human civilization is made of that kind of knowledge, not what he calls abstract knowledge, such as E equals MC squared, right? We make the mistake, especially college-educated people make the mistake of thinking abstract knowledge is the supreme knowledge or what makes the world run, right? Hayek's saying, no. The knowledge problem is that the majority of knowledge that makes the world work is particular and situational. And here's the key, inseparable from the situation. And this is why he's saying command economies don't work, like central planners, the Soviet Union is like, this is why it doesn't work, because there's no way to know the majority of knowledge that makes up a civilization to coordinate all of the prices in an efficient manner that is not going to lead to a lot of trouble. Does that make, let me throw it back to you before I keep going. Does that make sense on what the knowledge problem is?
Yeah. It actually ties back to some of the things I've been thinking about the value of particular knowledge. And I had this period of going from sort of abstraction to just starting to read, if you're familiar with Palladium magazine and Bismarck Brief, like they are very much into this particular knowledge. And I started reading these things and I realized, holy shit, this is a completely different way of understanding the world, and there's something there. And especially the Samoburia's way of understanding the world as mediated by individual actors, right? And each one of those actors has a certain subset of knowledge about the world, and acts based on that knowledge rather than you could almost say that all abstract knowledge is particular knowledge, right? Even what the central bank does is just lousy particular knowledge, just lack of particular knowledge. So I guess that's how I see what you're saying about.
No,
But
that's an excellent association. And what Hayek is trying to point at, and von Mises in Human Action with the coordination problem says something similar. Entire another debate to get into the von Mises, as you could say, not technically the father of Austrianism. That would be von Barwas, who's a little further back. But in the book Human Action, he kind of lays out what is market equilibrium, what is the role of creative, blah, 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 blah. But the main point here to focus on is there's an essay that Hayek wrote that you might be interested in, and I believe it's called The Uses of Knowledge in Society. And you might argue that it's the greatest, Tyler Cohn said it was the greatest econ essay ever written. He said that because he was arguing that it shows what economics is about. And I think that's kind of fascinating how he describes is like, this is really showing you what economics is in the business of, and it's the knowledge problem. And the key point to what you were, that I would say in response to what you were saying, Hayek wants to prove that there are different kinds of knowledge, that knowledge is not all the same, that the character of the knowledge of 2 + 2 = 4 is different from the knowledge of I feel sad, which is different from the knowledge of plastic spoons at McDonald's, which is different from the knowledge of E = mc². That there are different kinds of knowledge that have different that can be applied differently at different scales. Because that's the other thing, like you were making the Federal Reserve knowledge. So that's a technical knowledge that has universal ramifications, but it's also particular in that it refers to, say, the United States of America. And Hayek would say you must never, ever lose sight of all three of those different qualities of that knowledge. So this would be the first thing he's saying. Like, we tend to say an idea is an idea, but Hayek is almost coming along and saying, no, identify the different types of dimensions that apply to every idea. And that's actually a role of the philosopher. To look at an idea, like let's say central banking, and say, what kind of knowledge is that? Well, it's particular because it is not global, even if it has global ramifications, because it's particular to America. But it is also not the same as ordering plastic spoons on Ward's Road, because you can set a rate for the entire country, even if you don't live on Ward Road in Virginia. But it is also not the same kind of knowledge as who was Hamlet in literature, right? And you see, if you don't take the time to ask the questions, what kind of knowledge is this? Then you're going to probably start asking bad questions about it or approaching it in bad ways. His main categories are going to be particular knowledge and abstract knowledge, I believe is what he calls them. And the difference between that, you could say, would be the particular knowledge is would be something like, how many plastic spoons does McDonald's need on Ward Road, Virginia on February 28th of next week? That's particular knowledge. Whereas abstract knowledge is knowledge such as 2 + 2 = 4, or Hamlet is a character in a Shakespeare play. And the reason those are universal is because, let's put it this way, anyone in any condition who has access to the Shakespeare would be able to answer the second question. Whereas the first question is more particular because only a person who works at the McDonald's on Ward's Road would be in a position to be able to identify how many plastic spoons they need next week. So another way to put it, participatory knowledge you can only get by participating in something, and unparticipatory knowledge, which is knowledge you could gain even if you didn't participate in the thing, right? And so those are those differences there. Does that make sense?
yes, all of it makes sense. I want to tie it back maybe to will and knowledge. So when you were talking about will and knowledge, it reminded me of bards, pathos, and logos.
Yes.
Right? It's very, very similar. And here maybe bard's diagram doesn't map to universal and particular. So it's interesting to have these different maps of knowledge and use them wisely, I guess.
I think that's excellent. And all of that, though, what I would say on that very idea of realizing that there are different, like, he talks about pathos, mythos, logos, you got this universal and abstract. All of this is a realization that there are different kinds of knowledge, different modes of knowledge, and different ways of knowing. And but then, of course, that begs the question, which mode should you use for what, right? Well, that's what only the philosopher would ask, right? Because philosophers think about thinking. And to me, like when I think about what is philosophy, I think basically, honestly, Jurij, most philosophy departments or like programs are actually not philosophy. They're the study of the history of philosophy, which has value. I'm not saying it doesn't have value, but there's difference between learning the history of philosophy and the history of ideas, which of course can function as a groundwork, but just because you have soil doesn't necessarily mean you ever plant anything, right? It doesn't mean the soil ever grow. When we start talking about what is philosophy, philosophy has so much to do with this certain asking questions about questions, thinking about thinking, identifying the qualities of the kind of thought that you're taking on so that you can better approach it, right? And figure out how to kind of unfurl it like unroll the scroll in a proper way. Please.
So what would be, because I mean, we can talk about abstractly about philosophy as long as we want, but what would be the fruit of your philosophy which you aspire to?
Is excellent. The main things is self-defense and motivation, the ability to navigate different communication. So you don't one of the main problems in being human is we're perpetually misunderstanding one another. So that actually destroys relationships. It destroys friendships. It destroys marriage. Philosophy will help you actually be able to identify what a person means, even if they say something else. It has a lot to do with the coordination of different capacities into a single ability. Like my friend Clayton once said, wisdom, if you think about riding a bike, you have to do many things to do one thing, right? So you have to balance, you have to see, there are many things for riding a bike. Philosophy is the coordination of the many things that the human being does into a single life and to do it well without falling off the bike, per se. Definitely has a lot to do with self-defense because you're going to have a lot of people come along and tell you what you should do with your life, what you should think. Without philosophy, it is very difficult to defend yourself from those ideas because people tend to come with moralizations. They tend to come with very convincing cases of what you should do. Second, philosophy, funny enough, for me, it has a lot to do to keep ideas out of the way of your eyes. Because we tend to not see what's in front of us. We tend to see our ideas, but we tend to do that without even realizing it. So you learn how to keep ideas out of your ability to see, and then let ideas come in to help color and to interpret what you just saw. So you begin learning the ability to how to clearly observe phenomenology, to see, and then to interpret, as opposed to letting interpretation get in the way of clear sight. I think it has a lot to do also with keeping you from emotionally overreacting to hearing ideas that you don't like or disagree with. So you kind of work on your knee jerk. I think it helps actually also motivate because you can see wonder. It also adds philosophy. So I'm giving a broad overview here. Philosophy also, I like to say that a lot of life is kind of both distance and depth. A lot of life will tell you how to have great distances. You get in a car, you travel, you have new experiences, and so on and so forth. But how do you get more depth to life? And if you travel a great distance, but you don't have any depth, it's shallow. But at the same time, if you're really deep, but you don't have any distance, you don't go anywhere. And so what you have to do is have a kind of lived philosophy, because that's how you're more diagonal, where you're going distance, but you're also having depth to it, because you have to be able to experience, say, the world around you in a deep way. You have to be able to experience people in a deep way, so that any distance you travel, any relationships that you don't stay shallow. They get a depth to them, as opposed to, say, just gathering experiences and gathering all these things. Well, then it's like collecting glass beads from the Herman Hesse novel, or it's about collecting Pokemon or different things. So another thing I would say, and then I'll let you respond to any of that, is that it is very difficult for the human being to not treat life as a collection of individuated things that you're just collecting into your life, that you're kind of showing off almost as trophies, right? To make life have a sort of creative connection, to make it have a depth of roots, that connect all of the different things that you do, philosophy can help give you that depth, because it can help cultivate the beauty, the truth, and the wonder that gives a depth where your life is just not a collection of experiences that are fragmented apart. So self-defense, the ability to self-defense, human motivation, the ability to actually use knowledge in a way that you will differently from, say, basic consumerism, so that you will things that cultivate better skills. Like, for example, it's very difficult without thinking to, say, desire to have philosophical conversations like this as opposed to go to McDonald's, right? It's very difficult to train your desires in a manner to want things that bring out certain depths to life that otherwise you would not have, right? So a training of desire, I think Hegel's correct on the training of the instincts in a manner to where you use instincts not to escape them, but to actually sublate them into a fuller experience. The ability to work with language, to understand other people, to work between different language games, to work between languages, between sexes. The ability also to coordinate many different parts of your life into a whole, and so that your life has depth, not just distance that is shallow. So those are some things that come to mind.
Reminds me of Nietzsche saying he can just sniff out the bullshit philosophy. There's no other repudiation which is necessary other than just sniffing it out.
That's hilarious.
But so the part which resonates with me is actually figuring it out, because I already do. For me, philosophy comes very personally and very like from a. I feel like I'm starting much more pathically than logically and intensely, and sort of that's the way in which I deconstruct and unfold my experience, and that's the way in which I learn. So I could say that, you know, I am driven maybe more by will than by knowledge, at least personally, right? And so the parts which interest me is not necessarily, okay, outlining a theory of motivation or like, oh, how to defend yourself, blah, 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 because I feel like, oh, shit, like my life is already working in that sense, right? It doesn't necessarily, like if I need to, I don't feel like I need to learn self-defense or a theory of motivation for myself. But what I do want to know about is the actual nitty-gritty, like let's call it the particulars of philosophy, you know, the markets, okay, well, okay, we're in this particular situation. How do we particularly think about it? So this is the part of your thinking which fascinates me the most, actually, is when you start talking about economics, about markets, about connection of libido to it. This is where my brain starts churning, because I feel like I have internalized the motivational aspect, so it doesn't necessarily, you know, tickle my fancy.
Outstanding. Well, one of the things too I was going to say that I think has really hurt philosophy is that it actually doesn't study things like economics or sociology or politics or military defense and different things. And actually, in a way, I don't want to say it ends up wasted, but it ends up, these fields then actually end up lacking this way of thinking that I think is utterly necessary for them to function as proper. Because like I was saying on economics, like what ends up happening is like Keynes just assumes demand. So another thing I would say, like when you read, so one of the things I think that's wonderful that you have that motivation already. I think most people today actually lack that. I think it's very important that like when Socrates, Plato, and even Aristotle are talking, they actually say philosophy like starts in wonder. Now, a lot of people hear that and it sounds really nice and cute, but what it means is actually something much more motivational. Like there's a certain motivation that is driving you. And there's actually, it's very interesting. A lot of the people I know that are really into philosophy, in my opinion, in the right way, when they were younger, never read books. They wrote science fiction, they were wrestling, they were doing non-philosophical things. And that's actually what Plato, Socrates, Plato in Book 7 of the Republican says how it's supposed to be. They're like, don't you dare introduce books to kids before the age of 10. They're supposed to be out playing. They're supposed to be like mesmerized by life. Then ideas come. And actually what they want is if you introduce like philosophy, like the books and all that too early, it will kill them. It will kill their mind. It will destroy them. And I think it's a pretty profound notion that they're putting out. Also, interesting enough, they situate learning not so much in terms of like topics, but basically like problems you want to solve, and use whatever resources you need to solve them, rather it be from economics, literature, philosophy, your garage. Like, make kids see learning in service of figuring out problems, not learning as the memorization of a field, because that's going to kill their desire to learn and it's going to feel arbitrary. Please.
So, shall we then jump? Everything you're saying makes sense, but shall we then jump to the problem of scale?
Yes.
Because, yeah, so that's one question. Another way to put the question is, what are the historical examples of theory of education, which you're sort of outlining here, right? Actually influencing the world. What are the, because if you look at I mean, I don't know too much about this, but I would presume if you look at the academic system, right, it was made in a time where you were supposed to industrialize people, sort of, well, okay, if you go back first, it was, the study, blah, 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 church, then it turned out to be a great thing for industry and, making people great workforce, right? But when does this, the creative approach to education, does it ever scale? When does it happen in history? You know what I mean? Like, let's be pragmatic about it. I get it. Like, fuck yes, let's do all those things, but I don't see it happening. I think it's just aristocratic. It's just
It has
aristocracy.
traditionally always been aristocratic. So a few things. No, exactly right. It has always been more of an aristocratic apprenticeship model. You've had apprenticeship models, which has been like you could take anyone to learn a craft under anyone. You plug them up with an older person. It tends to be a one-on-one education, which is pretty fascinating. Two, it would be kind of handing down from a family lineage, so kind of passing down a skill. Three, it would be kind of more aristocratic. So for most of history, you had a very, here's the key. The best education has always shown to be radically individualized. So you even take like someone like a John Stuart Mills, the father of kind of utilitarianism or different things. His father is giving him a very aristocratic education and different things. As you introduce more and more people to the education tends to become more general as opposed to one-on-one. And when so, it tends to move in the direction of memorization. When this really started to occur, to give just kind of the historical precedent, was actually with the printing press. Because with the printing press, what ended up happening is you had a new conception of actually childhood, funny enough. If you go back to medieval paintings, and Neil Postman talks about this in The Disappearance of Childhood. There's the Oxford scholar, her name escapes me, that talks about this in the arts. What you'll see is all the children are actually just small adults. The concept of a child doesn't really exist. But then when the printing press comes out, a child is someone who doesn't know how to read, and an adult is someone who does know how to read. So maturing becomes literacy, the ability to read texts. But this transformed the entire character of education to be about the spreading of literacy at scale. And this also occurred because literacy and writing are tied together with bureaucracy. Like Karatani will talk about this, and Ong will talk about this. You can't have kind of government functioning bureaucratically unless you can't have the writing down of laws or function or structure that is passed on to people that everyone can universally understand. So with literature, with the printing press, then there was a transformation on being an educated person as knowing literature, which then, of course, meant being able to read, which then became following orders. So you had this ability to then follow orders, to do what the system said, and to the degree you could fit into the system was to the degree you were an adult. As opposed to, please.
So what you're saying is technology transformed education.
Yes. And if you go through history, that's basically and that's why we were talking about the other day. So much of this has to do with breaking down the college monopoly on credentials, removing the trivia structure of education, bringing back employment testing so that people don't have to have a certain certification from a university. They're able to just show that they're able of doing it from their own, because the internet makes possible aristocratic education at scale. Like I was talking with Michelle Bowens about, like what you have now is the possibility of small group dynamics at scale. with the decentralization of education that is allowed by the internet, by what Ivan Illich talked about in deschooling education as learning webs. So I'm now able to say, have a conversation with you around the world for a very, very easily, very low cost, where we can talk about what we want to, be interested in, and discuss things as we want, which this is a simulation of an aristocratic education. We are able to do that. Now, of course, the question is the following. Okay, but how many people want to do this? How many people have the desire to do this sort of thing? Because the technology is now there to allow individual at-scale aristocratic education if people want to do it. Okay, so now we're back to our knowledge one question, right? How do you make people want to do this? Because this is the reason why I was talking about Hayek on the knowledge problem. If there are many different kinds of knowledge, then you can't focus on knowledge as changing want. You have to focus on changing want, because that is the base motivation of engaging in different kinds of knowledge, right? So, you know, a lot of times what we've tried to do on the problem of scale is to ask questions of, well, how do we get people to know the right facts? How do we reform 24/7 news so there's no fake news? How do we get people interested in different things? Well, that's the wrong direction. But please, Jurij.
So right here, I think 99% of benevolent ideas fail because they fail to take into account the markets. So it's a sort of, oh yeah, we can, you know, do this to facilitate people becoming interesting in this thing and to help education. But that not being, you know, not having the engine of the market to help that, and fighting the engine of the market, which is TikTok and stuff like that. So the question really becomes, so okay, here is the main question is, do we become fucking, because this just, okay, you take into account the markets, you take into account, you have to influence people's libidos. Doesn't this become absolutely into social engineering noble lie territory? Because you have to be particular enough and you have to be technical enough to, like, because anything we say which should be important enough should be able to be implemented. And as soon as we start talking about implementation, we start talking about some sense of social engineering and competing with, you know, marketing, right? So like, just taking it to its logical conclusion, it's basically a noble lie with a combination of high tech. Like, it's not, I don't see anything else here, right?
What you're asking is spot on. It is completely mistaken. When I'm talking about the problems with the knowledge problem, that gets into where people are fighting the market, because they're like, well, we have to change how people know and what people know. You know, can they know through TikTok? Can they use TikTok? Can they know about goods on the store? And people want to mess with the market mechanisms. One of the reasons I defend Hayek so much is basically that no one, no other system but capitalism has dealt with the knowledge problem or the coordination problem, which is the ability to effectively coordinate resources in a manner that people on average have access to them when they need it. So for example, let's say that we're asking bottled water. Okay, let me ask you, Jurij, where should bottled water go on this planet? You say everywhere. Okay, but some places need it more than others, right? How do you begin to even coordinate that? What Hayek points out is that this is what prices do. Prices are not about making a profit. They're about the coordination of resources. So for example, if down in Florida, because I'm in America, so I'm using an American example. In Florida, let's say water is $8 a bottle. Well, boy, howdy, I'm going to send, if I'm a water producer, I'm going to send as much water as I possibly can to Florida, because I'll make $8 a bottle, right? But what happens when I send a lot of water down to Florida? The prices come down. But let's say that the water up in New York is 25 cents a bottle. Well, I ain't sending any water up there. I'm not going to make any money. So guess what? Prices start to go up as the water is used, right? So prices coordinate resources. And there has been no civilization that has managed to effectively coordinate resources without prices. And the moment you have prices, you need to then have a legal framework in a market to make those prices possible, ergo you need capitalism. And if you mess with that, you end up with mass starvation, you lose technology, you don't have, like another thing is, if I'm in Lynchburg, Virginia, and my internet sucks, very slow. Well, then you have a great incentive to make a high-speed internet company in Lynchburg, Virginia, because nobody has it. So I could make a lot of money, right? So as a business owner, I then have an incentive to create a business that offers high-speed internet in Lynchburg because there is none of that, right? So I'll have a kind of monopoly. But then as I start to do that, other businesses will be like, dang, Dan's high-speed internet company sure is making a lot of money. I want to get some of that pie. So a competitor then comes in, which then, of course, brings down the prices of the first because now they're competing with that. And you see this organic, it's organic emergent behavior that leads to the access of goods at prices that people can afford, right? Now, it's not perfect, and it's never perfect because corporations inevitably use government to get advantages, and you throw off various mechanisms, and you never have a free market. There has never been a totally free market. There's always been a mixed market to some degree that advantages others over others, and so on and so forth. But the main point, and this is, I think, to Kourtani's part, is that all efforts to reform, all, say, communist efforts to reform the market has overlooked the capital nation state, which is that it all comes as one. And if you try to reform, say, the market without reforming the state, that doesn't work. If you reform the state without reforming the market, that doesn't work. But if you reform the nation, which is like the ethos of the national identity, people get pissed off because they don't like you messing with their story. So that doesn't work. So you have to talk about the whole thing all at once. Well, how in the world do you do that, right? What does that even look like? Well, without it being totalitarian, it would have to be creating a space for a competition of wants, because we go back to the wants issue. Like, what formulates people's desires and their wants? Because you could be changing what people wanted without messing with the market mechanisms, right? So, like, for example, right now, I want to be talking with you. I am not, say, spending money at the mall, but I'm also able to do this without, say, attacking capitalism or losing the benefits of there being a mall that I could access if I wanted to, right? So for some reason, I have a desire to engage in this sort of activity, which financially is cheaper. It is also resource-wise more sustainable. It's also more pluralistic because we're talking across, I'm not just speaking with other people in Rustburg, I'm speaking with people across the ocean. It is also more democratic because we're exchanging ideas, on and on and on and on. So there's a lot of things that can come out of a Zoom conversation like this that are different in how they formulate the subject or the person than other activities, but we are able to do this within capitalism without a communist revolution or different things, right? So the question would be the following: could you scale the desire to do this kind of thing, which, please note, is not saying that everyone needs to do philosophy. It is to say that everyone is in a space where they have a certain enjoyment in relation, in conversation, or they have a different way that they want to do things, right? So there's a difference between scaling a system and scaling a motivation, of which in motivation, there can be different customizations and particularity to what people want to do, right? Like if I scale intrinsic motivation, which is the ability to be your own motivation. You could be motivated to, say, make music, or to, say, run a business, or to run a wedding venue. I could be motivated to, say, go fishing or different things. But that motivation is intrinsic as opposed to extrinsic, which is trained from an external environment upon me to do certain things that may make me more capturable in a Deleuzian sense, or different things. Please, Jurij.
So I'm hearing two things here. One, the will of a person is not perfectly bound to the market, but is actually some sort of loose binding where a person has a freedom, like many degrees of freedom of action, irrespective of the markets. The markets are still there; they can be ignored, but there are certain degrees of freedom. The other thing which I'm hearing and which I'm connecting to what you were saying that Sunday on that conversation about communism is the way that conversations influence libidos. And so what you're saying or implying is that the way to scale intrinsic motivation and to escape, the perfect bind to the market, but rather to in large degree of the degrees of freedom and, empower the libido of the person, or however you want to put it, is through scaling online conversations which can inspire and intrinsically motivate.
Yes, sir. That's definitely a central pillar of it. And I would say now that would require, though, a reforming of primary education to where you are learning that this is what it means to be educated. This is kind of the critical step in a lot of the picture, because right now, the subconscious association is that an educated person is someone who is learning things that get them a job. Well, that's what? Participated in the material condition, participation in the system, right? So you are then using knowledge and education not to expand or to operate within that realm of freedom that I do think exists, because this would be my critique of the Marxist. The Marxist overemphasizes the material condition. The Frankfurt School talk about how we're constructed by the discourse as if the subject is only a product of the discourse, therefore they're entirely determined. There's too much determinism in all this. And once you think that way, well, then the only way to get freedom is to what? Destroy the system and overturn the system. Well, guess what you just did? You got rid of our answer to the pricing, the knowledge problem, the coordination problem, and now we're all hungry. Now we can't get bottled water, please.
They assume a tight binding between the individual and the market, which doesn't have to be so.
Exactly. And the hope of belonging, again, is to make very clear the case historically that it is not so. I think you can historically show that it is not the case. If you go to The Great Enrichment of Dietrich McCloskey, I would even say book 1 of The Capital is where Marx has to argue that the idea of exchangeability has to be created, which required a discussion of the merchant, a way of talking to convince people that a fishing pole could be worth, say, 4 fish or $20. That's not given in nature. You don't see monetary value in nature. That is an idea that gets a certain objective manifestation because you are convinced that that money works. But this is all because of a discourse. And the great debate is that I want to argue we need to say human history as a tension between what I call discourse, which is the structuring of the subject in a low-order causational way, so just basic, like following market values, and rhetoric, which is the creative possibility of the ability of human beings to talk in a manner that transforms and more freely gives them agency on the construction of the subject. The problem with like a Foucault or Adorno and the Frankfurt is they're not wrong when they say the subject is a product of the discourse, like Marcuse and all those people, and they're trying to be very Marxist with it. But the problem is that history shows you that there's not, quote unquote, just discourse. There's also rhetoric. There is a way of talking that actually creates freedom. So the problem is people talk about the material condition. Michelle Bowens and I were talking about actually it's what do they call it? Historic materialism. You could also talk about historic idealism. And really we need to talk about, as I was saying the other day, the medium condition, because the medium condition changes the kind of way people talk, and the kind of way people talk, which is not just verbal, but it's also mental, it's also relational. It is the way that you engage in a feedback loop with information that you then participate in. There are different kinds of ways of communication relative to the technology that can create more freedom or less. But please, Jurij.
So now when you said medium, you're referring to a communication medium?
Yes, sir.
Okay. This distinction between rhetoric and discourse reminds me of a startup idea I had of basically recording all your words which you say and then running inference on it to figure out outside influences on you, right? And so you could actually do sort of, say, measurable psychoanalysis on yourself to see what influences you from the outside versus how much, let's say, free speech or rhetoric you're able to practice. Yeah,
that's brilliant. And I would actually argue with hopefully the book, like one of the reasons the view of like the Frankfurts or whatever came to be like discourse is purely materialistic and we don't have any freedom was actually just a result of a lack of the technology to kind of follow and trace the ways discourse are not reducible to the material condition or the structure, that there is emergent principles and there is creativity that is involved in the subject. Like right now I can come up with like couch playing. Couch playing. What does that word mean to you, Jurij? You don't have to answer that, but I bet you could answer that, even though I just came up with
it again.
Couch playing, or chair playing. What do you think a chair plane is, Jurij?
Flying couch, my friend.
Okay, so that's a word that doesn't exist. But right there, right then, we were able to create an idea that doesn't exist and to think accordingly to it, right? So in real time, we created language. And here's the key. We created language that was intelligible to us. Well, that means we have degrees of freedom. Please.
Man, that ties to my thinking between psychoanalysis and, say, structural anthropology on one hand, and say phenomenology, qualia phenomenology, Buddhist phenomenology on the other, which in a sense create space. And the couch example is just like taking the space of all possible conversation, just like picking one, dimension and saying, oh, this thing, right? And so the ability to step out of the knots of discourse is important, which can be actually trained. But on the other hand, understanding the mechanics of discourse is equally as important, because just trying to solve it by diffusing it is kind of weird, because as soon as we start have a conversation, we are already in some knots, and society works that way. So you cannot just release everything and create space for everything. But this small phenomenological part of creating space and adding degrees of freedom and more dimensions seems really important. And so now for me, that's tied to economics and rhetoric and discourse, and how actually conditions of possibility for some sort of freedom may be created. Yeah, it's funny because it was only personal to me, this psychoanalysis versus Buddhist meditation. Now it's clicking to a larger economical thing.
Oh, outstanding. I think everything you said is spot on. And I think it's so critical to realize, like, couch playing, like, we know what the word couch is. We know what the word plane is. So it's not devoid of any structure. It's not devoid of any meaning. But the fact that you can instantaneously put them together, create this kind of new node of creative freedom, that then the structure in a way rushes in and makes it seem like it was always structural, is one of the reasons why we lose the distinction between rhetoric and discourse. Because it so quickly is then absorbed into our regular speech that it seems like it was always already just regular speak. But that little moment, like, creativity is kind of glimmer. The space is a glimmer, but the key is that glimmer changes the quality of the whole. If, it's like Layman Pascal says, the difference between 100% and 99% is insane. Right? There's a radical difference between the loss of that 1%, because that little space of 1% uncertainty changes the quality of the other 99, because they have to make space for possibility. You can't totalize. You can't completely determine. So likewise, to realize that, yes, the majority of human language is, we kind of know ahead of time, it's pre-exercised in different things. That's all good and well. But realizing that I'm able to say couch playing or snake hot dog, you could imagine what a snake hot dog is, right? The fact that that's intelligible to you without ever having heard it before, that means we're not reducible to mere discourse. We're not reducible to mere structure. We are able to creatively use structure. And here's the point. We have too much studied economics as a product of discourse without any space for rhetoric. We have too much studied philosophy as discourse without any space for rhetoric. And as a result, the quality of the whole of philosophy or the whole of economics has shifted in a stagnating way, or an ultimately self-effacing way, or a manner that's unsustainable. The mistake is to think it's unsustainable because it's, say, capitalist, or because it is philosophy. No, it's that it's missing that creative element that could be the negantropic river hole, as Cadell has talked about in his book, that then changes the quality of the whole. But then the question is, how do we socially, and then I'll give it to you, how do we socially make more of that opening for that creativity? Well, we change the educational structure to make the honoring of that opening what it means to be educated. Like, that's the key. Like, right now, the subconscious association of being educated is being good at the what? Discourse. Memorizing the discourse. I know how to get the passage on the test. I'm a smart person. Literally, that means being intelligent and being educated is contributing to the discourse as opposed to knowing how to navigate the rhetoric. So mine would have a lot to do with reforming education from a trivia-based structured to an oral education, conversation-based education, the analysis of hard text, which is not memorization like Hegel. You don't memorize Hegel. You wrestle with Hegel, right? So I'm not saying you're removing books or anything. I'm saying you're changing the mode that you're toward them. This would also mean we have to remove, I would also remove the college. My material changes are about increasing the freedom of different modes of education, not imposing a single mode. Okay, you want to do a memorization test in school? That's perfectly fine, but don't give it a monopoly, which suggests that the only educated way to do things is by test taking, because that's when the discourse takes over the rhetoric and it becomes totally entropic. It has no creative entropic. So I would want to reform competition in education. There's a real sense of what I want to do is, you know how the market is about competition. My argument is that education doesn't have enough competition in it per se. It does not have enough different modes of thinking, and as a result, the system has become stagnant. It has lacked creativity. So you could say what I want to do is introduce competition to educational forms so that there is not a subconscious association with being educated, with being good at the discourse, which means you're incapable of rhetoric and you're not able to add creativity. But please, Jurij.
So basically what you're saying is the modes of competition that already exist in current education are rooted in a single current discourse, and therefore it's just useless and just over optimization instead of multiple different discourses competing, or different kinds of competition, which is more open-ended and creative. So that's one thing. The other thing is what you're saying also reminds me very, very much of live players versus dead players. Are you familiar with that? Yeah. It's exactly the same thing, and you're basically talking about the conditions of possibility for creating a live player.
Yes.
What's a live player education like? And so one thing, you know, there's this sort of stereotype in my mind of what a live player is. It's this sort of, you know, Silicon Valley entrepreneur, blah, 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 which is kind of already an oxymoron because it's a predefined role, etc. But so there is some binding which should be had to material conditions of survival there, right? So in a sense in which, okay, the current educational system, let's say, and not that it does it well, but let's say that it wants to help people survive and prepare for industry, right? Well, if you create something fully open in that situation, then okay, sure, we can philosophize all day, but it's not going to necessarily produce anything new. It's not going to help deal with the real per se if you just fully open the degrees of freedom. So there has to be some sort of binding to the real and testing by the real. So how do you think about that part? Because I mean, sure, okay, everybody can have conversations or whatever, but you know, where does this challenge of the real come in?
No, but that's one of the reasons why we don't want to directly say attack the market or to attack the system, because if you're going to have philosophical discussions, they have to be philosophical discussions that come back to the real and the concrete and the actual and the tactile knowledge. Like to change. So the main thing is, like what Neil Postman warned is that when we talk about education, we think way too much about the subjects that we teach. Like, oh, are they getting English? Are they getting history, or so on and so forth? What he says is we need to think about what are the messages implied by the medium of the classroom. Just like Marshall McLuhan said, what is the medium is the message, right? So Neil Postman is like, what are the messages of the medium of education today? Well, one message, being good at random questions on a test makes you smart. 2, there is someone in the room who knows all the answers and you just got to confirm your ideas with that person at the front of the room. 3, education is divisible according to age ranges, and that education tends to be of certain kinds at certain ages in your life, et cetera, et cetera. So he's like, these are all messages of the medium of the classroom that leads to a very automatic, alien, kind of like a robotic kind of way of thinking. right? So what in changing the classroom, oh, absolutely, you got to figure out how to do practical things like engineering a building, but you're going to learn how to engineer a building primarily through talking about it with other people versus memorizing random things that you might need on the job site. Let's put it this way. The majority of people who go through med school have to, well, like everyone who goes to med school, what do they have to do before they can actually become a nurse or a doctor? Residency, on the job training. The same goes for engineering. No one's going to give you full responsibility over a project before you've had experience, right? So basically you could say I would like education to bring the reality of the unavoidability of experience into the classroom and to talk and learn as if you should get good at thinking about what you are experiencing. That's what good philosophy does. You were saying good philosophy is not about memorizing abstract principles. It's the ability to reason live about actual tactile realities that are in front of you so you can better problem solve. That is primarily what I mean when I talk about like bringing in an oral structure. It is not just talking about what is beauty. It's the ability to reason experientially through problem solving with other people that is actually a reflection of how, dare I say, the work world is actually like, right? And that is a different mode of interaction. And it also gets rid of, say, like right now, the classroom as it currently stands requires, say, cheating as being wrong to operate. We have to make it wrong to use your phone. We have to make it wrong to talk with other people. In the world outside the classroom, nobody cares how you solve the problem. Solve the problem, dang it. So right there's a kind of arbitrary problem an arbitrary structure that creates legitimacy for the current education structure that is ultimately arbitrary and not actually helping you in the problem of solving real problems in the real world that tend to be on the ground with other people and experiential. Now, of course, you can't murder people. You can't like break the law in terrible ways. But the idea of, say, using your phone to look up an answer or asking the person next to you, what do you think about that? And that's cheating. This is the kind of Foucaultian moral structure that is needed to hide the inadequacy of the current classroom structure for the reality of what's going on. So, we talk about beyond good and evil. We talk about the Foucault structure of morality, power, and all that. Well, you actually see all of that alive in the classroom. And what did Foucault tell us that these things do? They keep alive the what? The discourse, the norms that then lead to alienation and oppression. Yes, it's still happening in the classroom structure. So to talk about a movement to the oral is not to talk about, say, making the classroom a perpetual philosophical conversation about the beauty, what is beauty, but to move it to a mode of problem solving or a way of interacting that is going to be what humans actually find out. Now, it turns out, I would argue this, though, it turns out that those abstract philosophical problems like what is beauty, actually, you do need to be able to answer and ask those kind of questions to deal with real world problems, right? Like philosophy is often where you find yourself if you just talk long enough. You don't have to make a point to be philosophical. If you're just trying to figure something out, you find yourself going, well, what is good anyway? Like, how do I know that this is what people should do? Well, now you're in philosophy without realizing it. You're doing philosophy right when you don't realize you're doing philosophy. It's just where the problem solving led you. And then other people come along and say, hey, you like philosophy. And you're like, oh, do I? Oh, I guess I do. I didn't realize it. That kind of flowing, that kind of ending up in philosophy is more the kind of mode of the classroom. But please, Jurij.
I feel like I'm starting to see the contours of what your philosophy is about, let's say, which is the way in which the individual, the motivational structure of the individual has its bearings in many different contexts. So if you take a look at economics, education, personal life, creativity, all of those are sort of different manifestations or like an interconnected web of the same sort of problem of, discourse and rhetoric and facing the real, right? So if discourse is basically the thing which helps people deal with existential angst, right? And then rhetoric is leaving that into, say, some sort of free speech, which would hopefully help us deal with the real. Meanwhile, while we are too weak or too existentially scared to step into rhetoric, we are using the discourse to deal with the real. Did I sort of...
There's a lot of fairness to that. I would also note that rhetoric entails discourse, but discourse does not necessarily entail rhetoric. See, the problem with like discourse is that it tends to then moralize, not moving beyond the low order causality or the structure of the society. Where in creativity, you have no problem with keeping the structure. You're not saying structure bad, discourse is bad. You're trying to avoid reductionism, which is a hot term on the liminal web, right? You're trying to say that there's nothing wrong with, say, talking about money in rhetoric. But in discourse, money becomes the dominant, say, quantifier of value, right? So like labor power in Marxist, right? Or something like that, right? Well, rhetoric would say, well, there's nothing wrong with money, but there's also something wrong with depending on money to determine what you care about as a motivator, right? So a rhetoric is not trying to, it's trying to open up, it's trying to avoid, you could say, monopolies. It's trying to avoid single ways of operating, not saying that any one way is bad. What's bad is being only able to operate in one mode. That's what's bad because human beings are multifaceted, dimensioned, and because, let's put it this way, because as we learn from Hayek, there are different types of knowledge, and there are different types of ways of doing things. If you only have one mode of thinking, by definition, that would mean that you don't have enough modes to switch between relative to the different kind of knowledge you're dealing with, right? So like if you are dealing with plastic spoons at McDonald's, you need to have business sense, tactile knowledge, a work ethic, the ability to relate with the customer, and so on and so forth. But if you're dealing with quantum gravity, you need the ability to concentrate for a long period of time, to think through complicated text, to sit in a still space, and so on and so forth. So you need different modes relative to different kinds of knowledge that resist the temptation to claiming that, oh, quantum gravity doesn't matter. What matters is being able to run a restaurant, or running a restaurant doesn't matter. What matters is quantum gravity. Rhetoric resists that. It keeps an openness to there being different modes for different situations. I would say it is very situational. It has a knowledge of different situational knowledges, that the openness and the creativity is not from a freedom from a restraint, but the ability to move between restraints and to create with those restraints, or what Hegel would kind of call determination. But let me give it back to you.
Please.
The
last sentence, to create with determination.
Yes, because in Hegel, like in like the philosophy of right, you find yourself in a body. You automatically are born with an abstract freedom that's like, I shouldn't have to be limited to a body. I should be able to do what I want. Hegel identifies freedom in not trying to escape the determinations of, say, your body, but actually seeing them as necessary for you to have any freedom at all. Because if you didn't have a body, you wouldn't exist to do anything. So Hegel wants to complexify the idea that limitation is the opposite of freedom. For him, limitation is what makes possible freedom if we learn to work with it, or to tarry with the negative, or to identify with it, as opposed to going, oh, I don't have freedom because I have a body. He's like, well, the only reason you have the freedom to think that you don't have freedom is because you have a body, right? So determination is part of freedom. It is what makes freedom definable. The question is simply, what do you do with it? How do you work with it? How do you tarry with it? And freedom is found in that negative tarrying.
So, okay, so the thought which just came to mind comes from the the problem of scale, right? Which is, okay, everything you were saying is fine, and I can see it being an aristocratic thing, but I cannot see it being a general thing. But then I remember that I guess this tarrying with this stuff, freedom, lack of freedom, etc., is what actually a decent chunk of people in the world do and have to do on everyday basis. And so, say, guidelines or skillful tarrying with this stuff, like people are tarrying with it regardless. It's
yes.
Carrying with it is not inherently aristocratic. It's and so it's a universal problem where everybody could use a hand, sort of, right?
Yes.
Which makes it a bit more, I guess, less black and white for me, in the sense of people cannot do anything, because I'm very, pessimistic about people. And so this, I guess, opens up a little gray area in my mind. But still, I feel as if the best you can do is, okay, first of all, I think that the clear distinction between aristocratic and general is important. Second, I think the best you can do in general is a religion. I am not at all convinced that there is anything better that can help people live their life than a given or a heuristic, right? Which religion provides. And so, I think this is just a philosophy design constraint, and that's what I think. That's why I admire Bard a lot, because he actually goes with this sort of, says, okay, fuck it, yeah, we need to find this one important thing, and then he goes back to Zoroastrianism and says, okay, yeah, the battle of good versus evil, the constructive versus destructive mindset, there's the heuristic, there's the thing, and okay, maybe this thing works out. Like, this is, and constructive versus destructive mindset is sort of, I guess, similar to the heuristic, or in the same ballpark as I not to put words in your mouth, but it's in the same ballpark as something you would advocate for. Because as soon as we start to get into more delicate territory and into Hegel and me working through my determination, etc., it's not general. It's not at all general, and I don't think it's applicable generally. It's maybe as useful as a design constraint for a heuristic one might make to then give out generally, but not as something which would be useful for people to know, right?
I don't actually really disagree with anything you just said. I think first off, the idea of replacing religion, like you could argue a bunch of people in the liminal web have attempted or thought about, is problematic. I do think, Bard opens digital libido talking about theology as the basement and different things, right? As religion and Zoroastrianism. And I think also, like you see, like a lot of people are talking about Jordan Hall converting to Christianity. There's this idea of, oh, we really didn't understand what religion was doing. We didn't really appreciate it. We should have paid a little more attention to that, right? So I think it's very true. I also think there will always, it is very dangerous to suggest that aristocratic equals bad. It seems to be an inevitable part of human existence that there is some aristocracy versus not.
Yeah. So I absolutely do not mean aristocratic equals bad. Like, the thing which is like constantly in these conversations with you, with Cadell, etc., it seems that there's like this general leftist view of like, let's help people, let's help the world. But then it's almost as if you guys are speaking about these capacities which are so impossible and hard, which inherently makes them aristocratic. And so I feel like as if there's a contradiction in what you're saying, because you're not making explicit that it's an aristocratic thing that you're talking about. Or I don't know if you're talking about it aristocratically or not. I mean, I'm all for aristocracy. I just don't get the context in which this is to be applied, if that makes sense.
Sure. No, that's outstanding. What I would say is, I don't always use the word aristocratic, because I almost it is definitely an art thing. It is definitely a skill thing. It is definitely an ability thing. Like, not everyone is going to have the same intellectual, philosophical, business ability or anything like that, right? And I think basically if your plan or scale is make everyone a philosopher, that's not going to work. And that's naive. So that's not correct. There are definitely hierarchies. The question is, are the hierarchies, I'll make distinctions of belonging again between a closed hierarchy and an open hierarchy, and talk a whole lot trade on the caste system in India and how that was actually very different before Britain came in and solidified it with the Brahmin class, and how it was open and there was subcaste and different things like that. You must have a map of social relations. There must be authority, there must be expertise, because otherwise there's confusion. And actually, in societies that tried to get rid of expertise, the people rebel because it's an information problem. If I don't know who the best pipe makers are because it's equal, I can't figure out how to fix my pipes. And so I was also talking, I'll have to have you, I'm going to hopefully post it like we were talking with Christian. We have to look at philosophy in a way. There are going to be better philosophies than others, but if we understand that philosophy has something to do with like helping people relate to themselves, conversation, self-defense, and all those things, then philosophy is a job with various levels of expertise that is no better or worse than pipe making. And that has a role in the community. The issue is that how do you create the social conditions of possibility where people see the philosopher as a skill that can help them deal with problems that are not making a system, but relating with other people, their own motivation and self-defense, that is just as valuable, just as great, and just as humble as the pipe maker, which then opens up a new role of occupation that is necessary, in my opinion, in a complex, pluralistic world in different things. So there is different, please, Jurij.
So here you're throwing a wrench in my distinction between aristocratic and general and saying there is a more nuanced social hierarchy, which is important. And not only that, but you are, or I am making the connection of tying it back to the knowledge of coordination problem, where the philosopher is the one within the market, within the hierarchy, and like cannot avoid it, and is priced in.
Yes.
And our philosophy is being priced in. And so so I didn't think after this, but I want to try to connect it with the problem I was speaking about, which is the problem of scale and generating change, quote unquote, right? And this idea of sort of this aristocratic set of abilities, which then would make the world better, let's say. But there is like a decentralized mechanic to it, a pricing mechanic to self-helpisms, and the degree of nuance of self-helpism, whether it be a highly sophisticated self-helpism as one we were talking about here, or some other self-helpism, right? And so oh my god, this is so Hegel. This is like, oh, what are the conditions of possibility which create my philosophy right now? And it's funny because now we are in okay, what are the conditions of possibility for this conversation? And like this very conversation is in some sense being priced in the market, is dealing with the knowledge problem. And so okay, so this is important, because the entire thing where I was like, oh, let's socially engineer this, let's socially engineer that, this idea of social engineering, of designing, etc., is suffering as in trying to be a pure observer, while actually it's sort of from behind us coming into being, right? That we are already being, that's sort of already being done to us. We're already being priced in. And so we are in this strange loop of a market of knowledge and money, right? And at this point, I'm fully lost.
Well, the idea of the philosopher as being located in the market, and the critical thing is to see the market less as the buying and selling of goods, as the information You could say some people talk about cybernetics. I'm not sure about that language, but you hear about cybernetic philosophers, Luhmann, different people, Deleuze, even with the, so there's this idea of the market. When someone like Hayek talks about the market, he is way more interested in the market as the information coordination system, of which arises relative to what is needed by the facticity. So the facticity is, I get thirsty, so I need water or I die. The market is the coordination of resources to make it possible for me to access water, which I want relative to my facticity. Now I want a red speed car. And there's the question of, why do you want a red speed car? Because I'm nervous that my neighbor thinks I suck and I want to impress him. Well, the market will provide that as well. But here's the problem. That function of the market might not be optimal, because then everyone is in a kind of mimetic desire, race to the top sort of thing, right? But the market absolutely works. It will get you that sports car, but is that necessarily best, right? And this is where I make the argument that the rational isn't the true. The market is absolutely rational. The problem is that rational and best aren't necessarily the case, right? And so a lot of the critiques of capitalism is that it works, actually. It actually gives people what they want, but what they want may actually lead to various dynamics that are unsustainable, or everyone is getting red sports cars. Now, we have to be careful before we start talking like it's necessarily bad that people have red sports cars, because that's where you end up in trouble. You would have to base that on some sort of actual deleterious activity that was happening on the world, but you'd have to go case by case by case on that, right? But the point is, market has a lot to do with a response to the condition that humans find themselves in. So the argument is the following. What is the condition in the world that has led to the arising of the liminal web? Because the liminal web is probably addressing some sort of market concern that has arisen organically that it is trying to address. Well, I would say generally it's the problem of pluralism, diversity, and globalization, which is the overwhelm of information that people are not able to sort, structure, make sense of, the problem of manipulation, the problem of not actually people like having traditional ways of living are no longer there. The social capital is gone. The 9 to 5 they don't believe in. They're not able to make enough money to have kids or to support a family. So there's basically what has happened is people don't trust the social contract. The social contract, a lot of people don't trust, or they feel tricked by, or they feel like things didn't go according to plan, and they're not sure why. So they're looking for why. And lo and behold, Joe Rogan will tell you. Lo and behold, 3-hour podcasts have arisen to help you sort with this complexity and different things, right? All of what you're seeing in this explosion of long-form content is a market response to some sort of demand that has emergently formulated in people because of the facticity, socioeconomic, political, economic situation. But now, of course, a lot of people are realizing that not all podcast forms are the same. Some can more easily be manipulated for monetary gains that then become sort of rivalrous. Please, Jurij.
So I want to hear what you have to say next, but I just want to sort of frame this.
Please.
In my mind, I have like implicitly thought about the liminal web as something which aims to respond to the world where the world is not as it should be, and the liminal web is a response to that. But I have, funny enough, and this is what you are speaking about now, I have not seen the liminal web as providing a service to the people who think something is wrong with the world. And so I'm just, you know, it has arisen as a market need for me who thinks something is wrong with the world, not that anything needs to be wrong with the world. Holy shit. This completely reframes it. I have no idea what consequences this has to how I think about it. It makes me less of a free agent. I think makes me feel less like a free agent. Makes me feel the ubiquity of the market, of the demand and need, and the inescapability of it, and that every interaction can be framed that way, right? That no matter how quote unquote sovereign and whole I want to be, I am still sort of free. And even if I'm, finding a community, this community is providing for a need, so what consequences does this have on how we think about agency and say live players, right? Are live players products of markets? Are they serving markets? What's the dialectic here,
Well, that's excellent. And absolutely. So there's a few things. One, the fact that you are serving a need or that we're in a kind of logic of market, luckily, like the whole idea, there's not just a single market. There's not just a single logic of market. That's where the rhetoric is a big deal. Not all ways of I can address your need in a manipulative way. I can address your need in a caring way. I can address your need in a manner that actually helps you independent of your relation to me. Like I could help you in a way that makes you dependent on me, like a bad guru, to use, say, Alex Ebert, right? I could use it a parasitical way to like boost my ego as a celebrity. Or I could meet your need in a manner that equips you to go on, never talk to me again, and actually be better off, right? So there are different ways to address need. And please.
Do we have different terms here? So maybe markets would be for the only binding about the money, and then what would be the sphere form of market?
Well,
maybe
but this is exactly what is
rhetoric markets.
This is what's happening. No, what you're getting at is very important. So I was going to say the problem is the word market in economics, in my opinion, has come to do too much. And as a result, there's way too much confusion. In the same way that the word demand is just there, and that's a problem. The word market, the way that Hayek talks about markets is very, very, very different and much more cybernetic than, say, markets that we think of when we think about the market. We think about Wall Street. Like even someone like an Adam Smith, when he's talking about markets, he's not talking about freaking shadow markets or like derivatives or different things, right? So this is part of the problem. Everything, we're always in a logic of exchange. But not all exchanges are the same kind of exchange as going to the grocery store. So the problem is a lot of times, in my opinion, economists will use the term market as a simile for general exchange, any kind of exchange between two agents or people, right? The problem is a market exchange is not necessarily the same as an information exchange, which is not necessarily the same as a gift exchange, which is not necessarily the same as a mob exchange or a learning exchange. There are different kinds of exchange. Now, under capitalism, that is predominantly defined by the logic of the market, all of those exchanges can be taking place and contributing to the market, but they don't necessarily have to contribute to the market in the same way. But because they exist as if they do, because that's how we experience it, it comes to seem as if the term market is enough to refer to the sum total of all those different modes of exchange. And yes, in 2024 America, maybe, but you forget the possibility of separation and distinction that can help you understand what's, say, going on in the liminal web or going on in your family or going through history, right? So the word market has come to refer to all different kinds of exchanges happening simultaneously under, say, a First Nation westernized world in 2024. But what that does is make you lose sight of the more essential formulation that is universal, which is exchange. Exchange is basically the character of all relations. And exchange is not necessarily bad because say I'm your friend, I may exchange with you food. You get food. I don't ask for anything from you. In exchange, I'm gaining an emotion of being like, you're my friend, but I'm giving you food. This is an exchange, but I don't think we'd necessarily say it's a bad exchange. But it would be different from, say, if I say, hey, these bananas are $50 and you give me $50 for the bananas, I think we could say that's exploitative, right? I'm taking advantage of, say, your hunger and giving you bananas that are $2 at Food Line for $50. That would be a bad exchange because I'm taking advantage of your situation, unless There was literally no other way for you to survive. Maybe in that situation, it's a good exchange, even though on the face of it, it's always a bad exchange. See how it's always situational. That ability to move between situations to judge the quality of exchange is really critical. So the liminal web is absolutely operating within the logic of exchange, but is it the same kind of exchange as a market food line exchange? No. It is similar in form, but not in content or accidents. Like it has a similar essence, but it is not an equal sign, if you will. And that's where the freedom lies. We cannot escape the logic of exchange. In the same way that in Hegel, you can't escape having a body. But the way you identify with that body or use that body is where your freedom is found. Like we were saying in Hegel, right? The fact you have a body that limits you is why you can even have freedom at all, right? The fact that exchange exists is why we can get better, why we can change our condition, why we can relate to one another in a valuable manner and have motivation to relate with one another. Like if I literally could not exchange anything with you, words, ideas, time, anything, you would not talk to me. No one would interact with anyone if no exchange was possible, right? So the exchange that makes there be motivation for human relation is also, though, the very form that can be captured by the market and reduced into just market exchange, making it then seem like that is the only possible exchange. And so that's when we lose sight of the other kind of exchange. And basically, for me to talk about rhetoric is to talk about a space where we never forget all the different kinds of exchanges. Discourse is where we forget the other kinds of exchange for one exchange. Rhetoric is where we realize there are different kinds of exchange. So no, you can never escape exchange entirely, but that is precisely why you can change exchanges and have freedom. And then the freedom is actually located in the agency to get really good at those exchanges. The freedom is the aristocracy per se. The freedom is the skill. The freedom is in the ability to improve. So far, here's the funny thing. In this conception, aristocracy per se is not what limits freedom. It is precisely the movement of freedom into its greater ability, right? But that's only possible once you stop trying to escape exchange entirely. That is for us to locate freedom in trying to escape determination, which Hegel thinks is basically suicidal and self-effacement. Instead, we locate freedom in the determination as precisely the defining feature of our freedom in our enhancement and skill of it. Does that make sense?
It makes so much sense. I would like to offer you my topological understandings of it.
Please, please.
So before this conversation, I was thinking about the live player as the one who is a dot who operates in the world, right? And he moves in the world. But with the logic of exchange, the live player is the one who interfaces with different dots through different possible connections or exchanges with them. But his freedom lies not in free for all movement, right? But in like navigating all of these exchanges. And so his freedom lies not in moving away from things or freely outside of exchange, but in skillfully navigating the determination of exchanges. So this is where Hegel connects. And I'd like to offer something out of the blue. I was doing a bunch of Shiva mantras and I was asking myself, what is power? And I was sitting there in the park next to a tree and, squashing bugs and feeling like a god or something. And the power, then I realized the power is the interconnectedness with stuff and the mutual dependence rather than sort of a naive power over, right? But this is like when a bug is walking on me, I have the mutual dependence is where the power comes in. Yeah, it's a completely different sort of paradigm shift and reminds me of, Sam Altman as the guy who is referred to as the best political games player in tech, right? And what that means is that he is great at navigating these exchanges and seeing exchanges which other people don't see.
That's perfect. That's exactly right. And, again, to go to that example, when I talk about couch playing, I'm taking different exchanges, and what am I doing? I'm putting them together. I'm taking different determinations, couch, playing, putting them together, and making a new kind of exchange. And I'm exchanging an idea with you you've never heard that you then make intelligible. So it's different from the exchange of couch or playing. I put them together, and the freedom is found in the ability to take determinations, make them relate in a new way, and then share them with you. And so a new intelligibility is formed. And so you see in the possibility of a term like couch playing, that suggests what is socially kind of occurring and why it is intelligible to move between different exchanges in different games. That's where the freedom lies. But that is only possible because the word couch means something and the word frickin' playing means something. It is then possible in accepting those determinations to make them relate in a new way. Right? So linguistically, that's very similar to what you're saying with Altman. You're really good at the exchange of politics. You're good at the exchange of the tech world, per se, those different discourses. Because another way to think about exchange is like a discourse is a kind of what? Exchange, right? I'm exchanging. So you'll hear philosophers talk about discourses and all of those different things. So much of what is this relation that people are speaking about. The ability to have mastery in an exchange or a discourse, multiple, and then to make them relate in novel ways. That's the creative act that then this is my argument, without capitalism falls into the great stagnation, growth rates start to decline, we get a lack of creativity at that point, capitalism moved from a non-zero sum to a zero-sum game because there's not enough nicheography. So here's the problem. Capitalism is stagnating, not because capitalism is necessarily broke, but because it's losing energy, if you will. It's losing in nicheography because you don't have enough people that are able to play the game of the multiple exchanges, if you will, right? So people see that and they say, this proves it. This proves that capitalism doesn't work. The mistake is that many libertarians argue that capitalism necessarily works. That's the mistake. No, it is contingent on the amount of players, if you will, amount of people who are able to create negentropy in the system, which is found in people able to relate the different exchanges. But to say that capitalism is contingent is not the same as saying that it's necessarily broken, that it needs to be entirely replaced. Communism as a valid idea is the negation sublation of there being a common space of many modes of exchange that can be considered and moved between and mastered. Capitalism does have a tendency to create a monopoly of a single kind of exchange because the people in power tend to like that because they've won that exchange and then they can benefit from it. Also, the human brain itself, but this is the main point I want to make on like the critiques of capitalism. Capitalism has gravitated toward a single mode of exchange because of the human brain itself, not because there are evil people trying to control everyone. It's more Kafkaesque. The brain loves simplicity. This is natural. We want the idea of there many exchanges. That sucks. I just want to have a single way to understand things and go from there. So the human brain naturally gravitates toward a mode of civilization that has a single kind of value, a single kind of schedule, a single kind of ways of doing things, what Foucault talks norms. The brain likes norms. And so we naturally through time create norms, but in so doing, there then aren't multiple modes of exchanges that could create the negentropy per se that is necessary for capitalism to function. So the problem with capitalism, if you will, is the human brain itself, not the system. Okay, then, if we want capitalism to be more negentropic then, more rhetorical, all the different languages, I appreciate you tolerating all of them. But if we want it to be more rhetorical, it requires fighting the natural tendency of the brain to singularize, right? Well, that's education. And here's the key. It's what everyone already is doing. Everyone is already creating the world into a single mode because that's what the brain does. They're already tearing with the negative, as you said. They're already dealing with problems. So what you're doing is, how do you have a way of educating or a way of thinking that doesn't tell people how they should live or what they should do, but make them use their brain in a less restricting way for their own sake on the competition of markets, right? That's what you're trying to do. It's more of like freaking health almost, right? It's like, like how do you give people more access to nutritious food or something? Or how do you make people want nutritious food? Is that saying that some people are better than other people? There are going to be people better at nutritious food than others, of course. But what you're talking about is how to open up people to an awareness of their brain to become singularizing, as it naturally does, to increase the probability that they don't fall into an entropic way of participating in capitalism, but something more negentropic. Please, Jurij.
So when you were saying that was going to be my next question, and you unfolded it, and this was the answer to my question, which I wanted to ask. So it's great. So this reminds me of who I think also Bismarck Brief wrote this, which is that Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator, he basically created the startup culture with his intellectual work, right? So he created a certain discourse, a certain set of givens, which would then shift what people think is possible, right, in the Silicon Valley and in the world, how people think about the world, and opened up space for a certain kind of rhetoric. Now, it's not infinite, it's not, but it is a certain kind of rhetoric where people are not only building, businesses of plumbing or what have you, but are now like, okay, we can use tech to create new tech to scale globally, which is like a completely new idea, which creates a new set of constraints or givens within which people can practice rhetoric. So that strikes me as job of the intellectual, right? Because what he did was he spoke to a certain demographic and to the certain conditions in the context of certain conditions in the world. There's like geek nerds and technology is accelerating. Oh, hey, dudes, we can make startups the new high status thing, right? And fuck yeah, it worked. So this is, I think, like he would be a particular instantiation of what you're talking about here, in a sense.
I think so. I think that's a brilliant way. And again, like I like examples like that. I tend to favor things like economic history, not like Dietrich McCloskey or different people like that. You could even say chapter 1 of like Karl Marx or biographies, because what you see in that is the range of in great works like that, you see a working with determination for the changing of the conditions of possibility that then unfold things in different ways. And so rather than like, when Hegel really takes history seriously, he's taking history seriously as an alternative to states of nature, like a Rousseau or a Hobbes, right? Which are hypotheticals. Like in the beginning, it was perfect, and then it's not, right? And Hegel's like, well, actually, let's just try to figure out what actually happened. What actually happened in history, and use that as the material of operation. Now, history does not give itself over to us objectively without interpretation, of course, but at least there's a material that there's a higher probability to work with, however imperfectly, right? So likewise, that's why something like the great enrichment that Dietrich McCloskey emphasizes is a big deal, or the birth of the concept of boredom in history that Patricia Sachs talks about is of great interest to me, because before the 1800s, we really don't see the word boredom anywhere in literature, and suddenly it appears. Okay, that change happened. Now, why it happened, we may not agree on, we may not know, but the fact it happened is something that's, dare I say, more objective than maybe particular explanations for why it happened, right? So likewise, the fact that around the 1800s or with the Dutch Empire, or whatever, I guess between 1680 and 1800, that the standard of living of the average person on planet Earth goes from $1 a day to 10,000% more in terms of air conditioning, heating, food, et cetera, et cetera. This happened. Okay, around the 1830s, the concept of sociology emerges. What happened to make this happen? So you're trying to locate your philosophical inquiries on these changes in histories in these historic moments versus a state of nature. Likewise, on a biography, okay, startups were geeky and then they weren't. Why? How did this happen? What did this occur? What is this? And here's the key. If it is possible for startups to go from geeky to cool, there must be freedom. There must be some capacity of agency to do something, maybe not all at once, but there has to be some changes in history means that agency exists. Like now, the agency may not be able to snap its fingers, but there has to be a working with determinations. Well, then we should figure out how to educate ourselves in terms of working with determinations. Like that should be the concern, which is not all heady. It's emotional, it's social, it's physical, it requires risk taking. The other thing philosophy is good at should be good at is risk taking, helping you assess risk, helping you think through risk, making choices, things like that. These are all the things that we see change the directionality of history. That then means history must be a thing that can change or go in different directions. But of course, here's the problem. Once it changes, it's as if it had to have changed because you never see the counterfactual, which means that reality always presents itself to you as if it's deterministic because that's how you must experience it. But that would be a mistake of confusing the clothing with the body. Just because reality is dressed in determinism per se does not mean it is essentially determinant, right? It just must manifest as such. So the question is, how do you direct that manifestation? And I think these historic moments, but please, Jurij.
Okay, I'm slowing you down here because I have stuff and I'm gonna lose it. So I would like to reflect how this conversation feels for me.
Please.
Which is a sort of, I started with an openness and asking my question, and they're sort of coming back to me in a different sense of like I'm being more disoriented, and the starting intuitions with which I would think about instantiating change in the world feels different, right? So it feels so previous it was like, okay, agent in the world doing stuff in the world. So with, my incessant talk about social engineering, and so now this question feels more in the realm of figuring out the determinations in the world and moving through them. So more like a certain type of cycle between the conditions in the world, the way they influence me, and the way I can influence those through, in the way in which I can work through those determinations rather than upon these determinations. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So working through determinations rather than working upon them seems like a crucial sort of intuitive difference to make here in my understanding of it, because if I want to be an agent in the world, I would move differently, because moving through determinations means feeling out the world and changing it, rather than moving upon determinations, which is like saying what I want the world to be and then doing it to it before even letting it move through me.
Yes.
So that's like a big intuitive change for me. And then another thing which I would like to connect to Samaburia again is so you were speaking about these changes in history and how there like these specific moments in history where something changes, we're like, what the fuck happened here? And how there are sometimes there are these people who can do these things and have these degrees of freedom. And it so connects to this great founder theory where the great founders are people who change so much of these givens or work so much through these determinations that after them the conditions are completely changed, and the way that quote unquote live players and dead players work in the world will be fundamentally changed after them. And it's also as if the great founders need not be they don't need to be a single person, right? Or a group of people. It can be, it's almost as if there's a nexus point, a node point of different contingencies and conditions merging and then spitting out completely different conditions. And maybe, just maybe, Bard simplifies it in saying that the only change which is relevant there is technology, and the constant is human nature, right? And that's how he, well, at least I read the first two books he wrote, so I don't know what's further down the line, but that's the way he sort of I guess freezes and takes one perspective on history, and taking technology as a variable, but in the places where you're mentioning these weird changes, it need not be it can be whatever the fuck happened there. It can be so many different things which converge. And this also works for Sambury's model, where he's like, I mean, eventually he just boils it down to the individual or to a group of people, but he also takes into account the particulars. So I guess what Bard is doing, he is taking a historical lens on these sort of mergers and transformations of different givens and releases and transformations of conditions of history, right? And he's taking a lens and just like rewriting it, as he talks about, or rewriting history from that lens. But which is really cool when you start from a particular and not from an abstract or like this lens that he takes. When you start from these particulars and you take these weird nodes in history, you can sort of appreciate the richness of these moments which lead up to them, and you need not reduce them to a singular theory. And the very fact of needing not to reduce them to a singular theory is actually something which gives birth to live players, great founders, because they're the ones who think through this richness of stuff which is happening, and this richness of stuff is being sort of forgotten and not examined. And so working through history and these moments actually gives you so much material to work with in the present, right? And you find freedom through the information, through the nodes and exchanges and the particulars, right? Whew. Things are connecting, man.
Well, that was outstanding. I mean, to your last point right there, it's very important to have, dare I say, a meta theory that entails multiple modes of exchanges, because then the very thinking of that facilitates becoming the sort of aristocrat that is artful in multiple modes of exchanges, that they can put them together in creative ways. So there's a danger in having a theory that entails only a single exchange or a single mode, right? Because if freedom is found in the art of multiple modes or the integration of different modes, then you must theorize in a manner that entails those multiplicities, if you will. Well, where Mr. Bard emphasizes the information technologies, the key is that the information technologies changes are what is exchanged through these information, like writing and oral and internet, is primarily discourse. And so the internet allows a kind of discourse that was not possible before the internet, but it would be a mistake to say that the internet equals the discourse. That's the key, is that this is how we kind of work with the bothness. So before writing, it is hard to imagine a great enrichment occurring, like Dietrich McCloskey talks about, because in an oral tradition, the majority of the human brain, following William Ong, was used to memorize the Torah, to be able to recite things perfectly, like myths, right? Well, after the paper, we don't have to use our brain to memorize so much. Therefore, there can be more creative work, more creative work, right? Well, because the brain is freed up that way, Once you then create the legal framework, because Dietrich and the cultural framework that Dietrich McCloskey talks about happened in the Dutch Empire, where you say two critical points. Work has dignity, where for most of history it didn't, and people should be free to do what they want. You add those two ideas, then people talk about them, they're able to create with them, create a different way of living according to that. And do you know what it turns out people do when you tell them work has dignity, that even dignified people can work, not just slaves, and that you should be free to do the work you want? Turns out people go start inventing stuff. They go invent things to improve their material condition, and suddenly air conditioning, insulation, flooring, all of these things start to be invented because you've told people there's dignity in work and you should be free to solve the problems you want to work on. Bam. That idea, though, was not necessarily embedded in the mere invention of the printing press. You needed the printing press for the thinking of that idea and the spreading of that idea, but the technology does not equal that idea. Why that idea arose gets into the magic of people, if you will, the creative possibility. So what you're doing there is, here's the key. Information technology is how you do indeed get general change. That's how you scale. But the capacity to scale is not the same as scaling a particular thing. So now that we have the internet and net tradition, which I think is an additional tradition from writing tradition, the Zoom tradition, this kind of interaction, we now have the possibility of a scalable change, just like the ideas of work has dignity and people should be free to work. The question is the following, though: what should those ideas be that are then scaled, and in that technology changes how the brain works to be able to handle those new ideas, right? Well, one of them we've talked about is that there are multiple modes of exchanges, and freedom is found in the movement between those exchanges and becoming an expert in that very movement, right? In the expertise and the art and skill and aristocracy of that mastery, right? Well, that's different because you're telling me to use the brain not just in a single logic of the market, but a holistic system of different values and values competitions by which I think with one another beyond just mere specialization, but a mastery of generalization, as they'll talk about in education. You're also, in changing the classroom, changing the idea that to be educated is to be good at memorization and to be good at that which gets you a job. You change that idea to where being educated has more of this rhetorical character, and you have the internet to spread that. You can change behaviors in a way that behaviors were changed, say, around the Great Enrichment, to lead to the Great Enrichment, which is the increase of quality of life on people. It's incredibly negantropic versus entropic. But please, Jurij.
So this, I guess, clear pills me, or I had like a clear pill idea, so to speak, which is this nimbleness, let's say, is actually found in quite a few people in the world. People are entrepreneurial, people run businesses, people are eager to deal with stuff in a given context, right? I'm just, I was recently talking to my grandpa and he had a business. My uncle has a business. People just find ways to do things. Like, neither one of them is a philosopher or an intellectual, but what they do have is a context which is sort of set and firm of how they work in the world, or how the world works, or like a certain set of givens, so to speak, where they're about, installing electricity and stuff. And that's just how they think of the world. And this goes here, this goes there, and they figure it out. And so I guess what here we are talking about is just transferring this inherent ability to navigate the world to a different context, which is the internet, which is, like, for me, which is what I was born into, in a sense. And so it's very confusing to me to see these people who don't navigate the internet. And it's also my peers. I'm like, what the fuck, people? Why are you just using the internet for scrolling Instagram? Like, it doesn't make any sense. You should be using internet to navigate it skillfully, to meet people, etc., to enrich your life. But actually, very few people are doing it. And I wonder why that is. I also wonder is that the whether the the enrichment which the internet offers is the sort of discourse shattering thing inherently, right? And so that's why it may be hard to navigate the internet, because on the internet you're navigating discourses
Yep.
instead of being within one discourse, and navigating discourses is hard. And so this shift from navigating within a discourse to navigating between multiple discourses is, let's say, a skill set for the new aristocracy. Now, whether there is a, you can just jump on the internet and jump within one discourse, you can, but that thing is then very much dependent on, what was your previous discourse, let's say. Yeah, so um would there be a quote unquote universal internet discourse, universal, like these one or two almost theological axioms which you would then use, which would suddenly unlock a lot of things? Have you thought about that?
Everything you just said is really good. So a few things. First off, on the great man of history comment, what I like to argue is that there are points of history where non-rationality equals a Nash equilibria and then leads to the escape of a suboptimal result. So the great man, a lot of times we say, oh, the great men of history are the ones who are the smartest or the most heroic and different things like that. Now, I think there's a problem in acting as if the existence of Marcus Aurelius didn't change history. There's a naivety to denying that. But also what really we have to emphasize is a lot of those points in history where things changes is where someone introduces more of a creative idea or something that seems irrational at the time that actually turns out to help you escape a kind of block that intellectualism ran into because it wasn't able to think creatively. So like John Nash talks about Nash equilibria, and what he means by that is in game theory, you have situations where if everyone does what's rational, you actually end up with a suboptimal result. Like you see this in military strategy. If everyone does what's rational, the world blows up, right? So actually the most rational thing to do is what seems irrational at the time and that no one agrees on, right? I don't like calling that irrational or more rational. I like to call it non-rational because it's thinking that does not fit within the schema of what defines rationality at the time. So in the movie, The Beautiful Mind, it's the example of if all the guys go after the hottest girl in the bar, no one gets a girl. So they all go for the second hottest girl and then everybody wins. It seems like an irrational strategy, but actually it's the best outcome given the dilemma, right? I would argue that a lot of the great people in history are ones that introduce non-rationality to a rational situation. And to me, that's a lot more dynamic than talking about they were smarter or they were more intellectual or they were greater. Actually, at the time, they were crazier. Like Paul Feyerabend in Against Method, that incredible book talks about how everyone hated Galileo, not just the church, the scientists, the politicians, everyone hated him. And when you go back on history, a lot of the great thinkers are hated by everyone. They are seen as irrational at the time. But now we look back and say, oh, no, they were the super rational. That's a mistake. You're misinterpreting what was going on by a retrospective knowledge of the outcome. At the time, it was irrational, and then historically would turn out to be non-rational. It was breaking up a suboptimal result, like D-Day. D-Day is only brilliant because it worked. It was incredibly non-rational at the time, right? Like there are all these things in history. So this is how I try to balance it. Now, the only reason non-rationality works, though, is because there's a collective situation involving history and all the other people who have created the Nash equilibria so that the non-rationality can have the outcome that it does. And this is how you get the balance between the collective and the individual. So the individual matters because they can add the non-rationality that would be worthless if there wasn't a Nash equilibrium that was socially constructed that the non-rationality could break through. You see how it works both now. So the issue is to think of the great man of history theory as the great non-rationality of history. And of course, non-rationality is only of value in terms of game theory because there's a Nash equilibria that it breaks through, right? So this is how, so please.
So what you're doing here is you're sort of outlining the contours of sublation, let's
Yes.
say, right? Because the way, at least, I mean, I've only listened to Cadell about this, right? I haven't read Hegel. So, but the way I've listened sublation being spoken about, it's very much this logical process of like negation and then moving beyond, right? But what you're doing is like you're saying, okay, this is how it happened in history. This is how great men in history sublated their specific circumstances, and it may not be that mysterious. There are degrees of freedom here. There is a certain mechanism of, retrospective affirmation and not realizing their challenges. You're outlining the I would almost call it phenomenological descriptions of rationality and
Yes,
non-rationality, right?
exactly.
How it feels in the moment. So I find this completely fascinating. This is a new way for me to see innovation, right? Uh, and outlining how innovation works, which is incredibly fascinating.
Well, and the
It's
problem, and not to interrupt, the problem is when we talk about in the last, in about 15 minutes, I'll have to run. I've really enjoyed this, Yuri, but we have another 15 minutes. I'm sorry. The problem is when we talk about great men of history, uh, the problem is the word great makes an impression that they were great at the time, when really at the time they were non-rational and crazy. Like no one liked them. And so we need to talk about the non-rational people of history, if you will, which then the word non-rational is inherently social, but not reducible to the social because you need the Nash equilibria. And that's when, you start to see how this works. It's more sublative, as you're saying. The reason why this is important is because then we can see, I like the word you were using, nimbleness is really important here. The characteristic of non-rationality that makes history tends to be nimbleness, which is not mere intellectualism or smartness or strength. It is a nimbleness. It is an ability to identify. It makes me think of the word anti-fragile that Nassim Taleb would use all the time. And what you said is really important. Your grandfather was nimble. I know lots of blue collar people that are way more nimble than college professors. There is no necessary correlation between IQ and nimbleness is what makes history way more than intellectual or anything else. Nimbleness as the thing that nimbleness, and I refer to things like childhood, anti-fragility, rhetoric, etc., etc. I really like that word. I'm going to have to use that word, and I will credit you because it is a really good word. And I think Nietzsche is getting at it with dance, with the play. There's this kind of nimbleness, right? But nimble is a better word, I think. Nimbleness is non-rational, and nimbleness is scalable. And the reason why I think nimbleness is scalable versus intelligence, philosophy, or whatever, even if philosophy as a job has a role to help free people to be nimble, you see, as like the pipe maker. So philosophy matters because it can be a service to help with nimbleness, but it is not equal to nimbleness. Do you see? There's a difference there. A pipe does not equal a home, even if the guy who can fix your pipes has a role to play. So you're locating philosophy in the market in serving this nimbleness. The nimbleness seems to be biological survival. How do I survive? How do I not die? It's what is natural selection, but in a sense, what does nature select other than nimbleness and anti-fragility, right? Like what seems to define biological life in general, in terms of survival or not survival, tends to have something to do with adaptivity, nimbleness, the ability to change, the ability to survive. Now, obviously, not every animal in human history has done so, but to the degree that there has been a mastering or a getting better at or creating the conditions of improving nimbleness, then the quality of survival tends to go up. It tends to be better. It tends to be more negantropic. So how do we increase the probability that the average human being on planet Earth is more nimble than less? Not because we guarantee any results, but because that seems to be what helps people navigate in a more evolutionary manner through complexity, pluralism, and diversity. But we have to be careful to assume that evolution equals better. It does not. It could just be mere change. But the reason why nimbleness seems necessary today for change, or at least why I'm interested in it, is because it seems to be necessary to handle pluralism, globalized pluralism, and difference. Because when I'm interacting with people with different beliefs and different ideas, if I'm not nimble, because nimbleness is fundamentally existential, like you were saying, different discourses and the moving between them, right? It's terrifying. It's really uncomfortable because you as an atheist or a Christian or whatever are talking with different people. How do you have the nimbleness without being overwhelmed by the existential anxiety that nimbleness requires? Well, that's training. Please.
This is where my question goes, right? So in the example, which was, I don't remember, cited 2 laws which started valuing work, and they open up like a certain space of possibilities for freedom, etc. Does this new freedom which is there, is it within a single discourse? Maybe I'm nitpicky here, but
Please.
Are people nimble within a discourse then? Or does it feel, you have this discourse, but then you're also, existentially nimble still in some ways? Or are you not, right? Like, is this, now that we're on the internet and we interface with different discourses, is this the nimbleness, the same type of nimbleness which we have seen in history, or not? Right? Because now it's existential. Now we are 100% moving through discourses. Have we done that before? Or was it just moving through fucking objects and mechanical engineering problems, right? You know what I mean?
I think that's a magnificent question. And I do think that there is a different quality to history right now in global connections that capitalism and all these things has led to. There were absolutely trade routes, Silk Roads, where you had Muslims, Hindus, and all interacting. But the key is that they were mediated by commerce. They were mediated by, even if I don't understand your religion or anything, that's okay, because we're here to talk about this frickin' spice right here. So the reason let me give it to you, is the reason why capitalism has spread around the world is because that's the only way we've ever known how to deal with pluralism. But because that's the only way the Silk Road ever did it, was through commerce. But here's the problem, is if you do that, then capitalism has a tendency to destroy culture and difference in its nature to create exchangeability. And then you get Dugin. You get the fourth political theory, you get China bifurcation and all these different things. I need to say more, but go on, Jurij, please.
I was just raising my finger in elation, but I don't understand the step between okay, markets. So this is wonderful. Okay, markets help cultures interface, which is such a fucking weird thought, actually, and is what a bunch of people who are all for plurality of cultures would completely miss that point.
They miss it. They miss it every time. Exactly.
Yeah. So it's incredibly interesting. But so what? So I guess the other way to put it is, different types of exchanges can help cultures interface, right? And so in this point here, you're saying, okay, the sort of markets of exchange of goods, right? But we need not necessarily limit ourselves to that, at least for conditions of possibility for the future. That's one thing. The other thing is, I don't understand the step. Okay, why does this create a lack of culture or like destruction of culture?
No, it's
and
excellent.
I don't understand how it leads to Duginism. So
it's excellent. So the market, like the logic of exchange, the logic of market exchange, and this is why I've been writing so much on Marx. Market exchange works because I convince you that this pen, one of these is worth 2 of these. Okay, so we can exchange them, or $20. So an equal sign appears, right? This pen is not this paper, though. Like, how do I make them equal? They're not. I have to reduce the unique particularities of these things into an abstract value called dollars to make them exchangeable. Okay? Now, If I do that, and you remember this as a pen, and you decompress it from that abstract compression, great. We've now had a successful exchange through a mechanism of an abstract idea that is really, really useful. Great. That's how the markets work. I can go about my business with the pen. You can go about with the paper or the money. The problem is there's something about seeing this as worth $5 that gets me into the habit of treating that $5 as more valuable than that paper and existing independent of that paper. And so the abstract valuation comes to be a thing in itself. It comes to be a kind of Kantian thing in itself, right? Well, then I look around the world, because I can price anything, and I see everything as representatives of that abstract value versus representatives of their own culturally distinct values and different things. And then I start pricing things and exchanging them according to that single abstract value, right? So what ends up happening is like Dugan will talk about Dasein, where every culture has unique Daseins and different values.
To combat the reduction of...
That's exactly right. And so, but what ends up happening is that equal sign. Here's the key. The equal sign, without that equal sign, I can't make these relate. They are not the same. Muslims and Christians are not the same. So I need a way to make them relate, and the market provides that. It said, well, they're worth $20. There's commerce. So commerce makes possible relation. But in doing that, tends to train us into habits of seeing everything in accordance with that abstract social value. The only way to not fall into that mistake would be education that reminds you there are different forms of exchange and you can't reduce everything to that one. It's only one option as a temporary means of intelligibility so that we can relate, but then we go back to our fullness. So you need the compression to relate, but then you must never lose the skill to decompress. But here's the problem. Once you compress, to decompress, you'd have to face existential tension, the real anxiety, and train your brain to do it. So the brain gets in a habit of singularizing, of flattening. Marx talks about turning everything into a personification, and then we leave it there. Because I'm successfully relating with the Muslim right now, and we're not killing each other, so let's not rock the boat and start talking about religion, politics, and sex, which would be acts of decompression, because what if we all die? So we didn't rock the boat. In fact, we said this is the end of history following Fukuyama, global neoliberal capitalism. We're going to keep everything compressed and we're good to go. And then you got the what? The meaning crisis. Of course you did. The meaning crisis is what follows from everything being an equal sign. Because an equal sign doesn't mean anything because there are no equal signs in reality. The equal sign is a pure abstraction. And so if everything becomes a dollar, of which makes possible relation, and you lose the decompression ability, you end up in a meaning crisis. But here's the mistake. The mistake that many more liberal-minded people are doing is saying the decompression, we should have never compressed in the first place. Oh, okay. See what happens if you get rid of the mechanism of compression. There's no way for people to relate. They tribalize. So if you get rid of capitalism, we have no way to intelligibly relate that creates the possibility of a gradual decompression because we're never even going to begin to relate in the first place because we have no initial grounds of intelligibility to give us reason to relate with one another. And so then we isolate, tribalize, and we never ever move to a pluralistic, globalized world, right? So if you get rid of the market, we're all going to isolate and atomize. But then if you don't learn to decompress, you're going to end up with Dugan or a reaction against the meaning crisis and the compression that's going to lead to, at this rate, World War III, unfortunately. Now, that's a little extreme, but basically that, and I'll give it to you, if all of the supply changes break down, if all the global trades break, the debt bubbles will all pop. The bond market's going to collapse. Now, this is a different subject. That's a problem. And so you have economic realities that will come to the play. But I said a lot there. Let me give it back to you.
Okay, shall we bucket the part with bond
market? Yes, with the yes.
For the next conversation?
Yes, that sounds good.
Let me reflect just a few things back to you, and then maybe we can wrap up because you have okay. So I think so what you described here with markets compressing difference, and then I think you neatly described how from this compression of difference, how it can flow into Duganism, right? Because, okay, each one of them has their design, and so we can so they're to retain some sort of identity to escape the meaning crisis. And I can also understand how the meaning crisis flows from this reduction of difference. And I can see how it ties back to my question about nimbleness within discourses, because this is where nimbleness between discourses becomes an essential thing to navigate this compression. So maybe we can at least escape it a little bit. So I'm starting to see the dots connect, but still I don't see any normative, let's say, prescriptive thing. But seeing the dots connect is very, very valuable, and is precisely the process of getting the determinations to work through me so that I can work through them.
No, I think that's outstanding. And well, nimbleness is absolutely like nimbleness is what would be required to have the compression of markets be more like a zip file where you compress temporarily to then decompress. So you need the nimbleness. The normative thing would see is that it's better to be nimble than not, because it is better to be able to interact with difference than not. Because the reason for it is difference is what makes possible the creativity, because creativity arises in relation to difference, without which the world becomes more entropic than negentropic. And if the world becomes negentropic, then it is going to become poorer. It is going to tend to dissolve into depressions, and that could lead to various wars. So it would be better to not end up in that than to end up in that. And therefore, the normative prescription would be the need to spread the conditions of nimbleness so that people are able to handle diversity and globalization and pluralism and so on and so forth, precisely so that there are then creative possibilities that occur in that diversity that then add negentropy to the market, so that the market is able to create value in a non-zero-sum way versus a self-effacing zero-sum way. And the hope would be to reform the education system in terms of medium more than subjects and content, so that people subconsciously associate nimbleness with being educated versus associate memorization, specialization, which are the opposite of nimbleness, with being educated. We right now make people subconsciously associate stagnancy with being educated, which is the opposite of nimbleness. So Duginism and all this follow, of course, because it's educated. That's what smart people do. Smart people end up in a world that is splitting at the seams, according to Duginism, in different things like that. And I think it is normative, not from an abstract consequence, but because of economic result, and normative based on the norms of biological evolution favoring anti-fragility, adaptivity, and nimbleness. So it is based on the practical reality of survivability being tied with nimbleness that also leads to economic consequences because of the creativity, because capitalism is good to the degree that it creates wealth, which is tied to creativity, Dietrich McCloskey, ergo rhetoric, and so on and so forth. Which then, to me, what we're talking about is, to speak of nimbleness is to speak of a certain knowledge of the will, a way to know how the will operates and when it is best. It's when it is nimble. When we will to be nimble, when we let our wills be organized by this kind of nimbleness between different modes of exchange. And that's where, instead of, I think, it being, going back to what we were saying on Augustine, it's not knowledge or will, it's a knowledge of how the will operates, which then makes us will a different way of organizing ourselves in the world, so that we know the world as more negentropic than simply a product of structures that are deterministic. When you separate knowledge and will, you basically are dooming will to be determined by what you know, and you can't change what's there to know, and so you're deterministic. But if you say it's just will, well, then there's no determinations, and freedom is found in opposing determinations versus working the modes of exchange, and you end up in the self-effacement of revolutions to change a system that can't be changed. So the hope is to say in this, that there needs to be a knowledge of will, of how it is best and when it is negentropic, which we've tried to kind of trace out, which would then lead to operating the will to be in a direction that is more nimble. And I do think that is scalable, because it is more based on, well, biology. It is more based on something we see in entrepreneurs, we see in blue collar, we see in white collar. It is not limited to a certain IQ. It is not limited to a certain occupation. It seems to be something that people have under the right conditions, and it doesn't seem to be so genetic. The conditions seem to be Necessity. You must be nimble or you die. Two, you don't associate nimbleness with immoral. And I guess that's the main point. The school system right now makes you subconsciously associate nimbleness with not knowing what you're going to do with your life, or not having any beliefs, or not having any like good use of your time, or not creating value. If those subconscious associations are there, people will believe it is uneducated to be nimble. And at that point, we're screwed. And so basically what we're saying in all of this is that nimbleness, as a principle, if you will, is a non-rationality that is to be introduced at this moment of history into the system of education to help it move beyond the Nash equilibrium that it is currently creating in its certain structure, so that we can avoid the suboptimal results of the great stagnation of modern capitalism Cohn talks about, of Duginism, of atomization, of the meaning crisis, to perhaps start talking about a new form of non-zero sum enrichment that has a lot to do with the capacity of people to master this nimbleness in these different modes of exchange. It's awesome. A pleasure to speak to you. This has been a delight, Jurij. Thank you for your time today, sir.